50 people preached about testimony. 1. Billy Graham, evangelist and preacher who often spoke about his own personal testimony of faith. 2. Joyce Meyer, televangelist who frequently shares her story of overcoming abuse and addiction through faith. 3. Nick Vujicic, motivational speaker born without arms or legs who shares his testimony of how he found hope and purpose through faith. 4. Beth Moore, Bible teacher and author who often talks about her own struggles with insecurity and how her faith helped her overcome them. 5. Robbie Zacharias, apologist and speaker who frequently shared his testimony of how he came to faith after searching for the meaning of life. 6. Tony Evans, pastor and author who often speaks about his testimony of how he turned to faith after experiencing racism and injustice. 7. Corrie ten Boom, Christian author and Holocaust survivor who shared her testimony of how her faith sustained her through the horrors of the concentration camps. 8. Max Lucado, author and pastor who often shares his testimony of how his faith helped him overcome anxiety and fear. 9. Priscilla Shirer, Bible teacher and author who often speaks about how her faith helped her through personal struggles and challenges. 10. Joni Eareckson Tada, speaker, author, and advocate for people with disabilities who often shares her testimony of how her faith helped her overcome the challenges of life in a wheelchair. 11. C.S. Lewis, author and theologian who wrote extensively about his own journey to faith and conversion. 12. John Bunyan, 17th century Puritan writer and preacher who wrote the classic Christian allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress, which is based on his own testimony. 13. Martin Luther, 16th century German reformer who wrote about his own struggles with faith and his eventual discovery of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. 14. Augustine of Hippo, early Christian theologian who wrote extensively about his own personal testimony of conversion and his journey to faith. 15. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German theologian and pastor who wrote about his experiences in Nazi Germany and his eventual execution for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler. 16. David Wilkerson, evangelist and founder of Teen Challenge who shared his testimony of how God called him to minister to gang members and drug addicts. 17. D.L. Moody, evangelist and founder of the Moody Bible Institute who often spoke about his own conversion experience and the importance of personal testimony in evangelism. 18. Charles Spurgeon, 19th century British Baptist preacher who wrote extensively about his own experiences of faith and the importance of personal testimony in preaching. 19. Hudson Taylor, 19th century British missionary to China who often shared his testimony of how God called him to minister to the Chinese people. 20. Elizabeth Elliot, missionary and author who shared her testimony of how her faith sustained her through the tragic deaths of her husband and colleagues in Ecuador. 21. Andrew Murray, South African pastor and author who often spoke about his own personal testimony of faith and the importance of prayer and devotion. 22. Fanny Crosby, 19th century hymn writer who often shared her testimony of how her blindness led her to a deeper reliance on God and a life of service. 23. Amy Carmichael, missionary to India who often spoke about her own struggles with illness and how her faith sustained her through difficult times. 24. Jackie Pullinger, missionary to Hong Kong who often shares her testimony of how God called her to minister to drug addicts and gang members in one of the city's most dangerous areas. 25. Billy Sunday, evangelist and former professional baseball player who often spoke about his own testimony of how God transformed his life and called him to preach the gospel. 26. J. I. Packer, British theologian and author who often spoke about his own personal testimony of faith and the importance of sound doctrine in the Christian life. 27. John Wesley, 18th century Anglican minister and founder of Methodism who often spoke about his own experiences of faith and the importance of personal testimony in evangelism. 28. A. W. Tozer, American pastor and author who often spoke about his own personal testimony of how he came to faith and the importance of seeking God with all our hearts. 29. John Piper, pastor and author who often speaks about his own personal testimony of how he came to faith and the importance of living a life devoted to God's glory. 30. Brother Lawrence, 17th century Carmelite monk who wrote about his own experiences of faith and how he found joy and peace in a life of simple devotion to God. 31. Oswald Chambers, Scottish minister and author who wrote extensively about his own experiences of faith and the importance of daily surrender to God. 32. St. Augustine of Canterbury, 6th century Benedictine monk who preached the gospel in England and often spoke about his own personal testimony of conversion and mission work. 33. Corrie ten Boom's sister, Betsy ten Boom, Christian author and Holocaust victim who shared her testimony of how her faith sustained her through the horrors of the concentration camps and inspired others to hope and faith. 34. Smith Wigglesworth, Pentecostal evangelist who often spoke about his own personal testimony of how God called him to a life of faith and miracles. 35. Catherine Coleman, healing evangelist who often shared her testimony of how God healed her from a debilitating illness and called her to a life of ministry. 36. Charles Finney, 19th century Presbyterian evangelist who often spoke about his own personal testimony of how he came to faith and the importance of revival and evangelism. 37. George Whitefield, 18th century Anglican minister and evangelist who often spoke about his own experiences of faith and the importance of personal testimony in preaching. 38. Sadhu Sundar Singh, Indian Christian missionary who often shared his testimony of how he found peace and salvation in Christ after a difficult childhood and struggles with his own identity. 39. Watchman Nee, Chinese Christian leader who often spoke about his own experiences of faith and the importance of surrender to God's will in the Christian life. 40. E. Stanley Jones, Methodist missionary to India who often shared his testimony of how he came to faith and the importance of contextualizing the gospel for different cultures. 41. Billy Graham, evangelist who often shared his personal testimony of how he came to faith and how it transformed his life, and who emphasized the importance of personal testimony in evangelism. 42. Ravi Zacharias, Christian apologist and author who often shared his testimony of how he came to faith and the importance of defending the faith in a skeptical world. 43. Jim Elliot, missionary to Ecuador who shared his testimony of how he felt called by God to reach a remote tribe and eventually gave his life for the cause. 44. Joni Eareckson Tada, Christian author and speaker who often shared her testimony of how a diving accident left her paralyzed and how her faith sustained her through that hardship. 45. Francis Chan, pastor and author who often shared his testimony of how God called him to leave a successful ministry in the United States and move to Hong Kong to start a new ministry. 46. Smith Wigglesworth's daughter, Alice Wigglesworth, evangelist who often shared her testimony of how her father's faith and ministry impacted her life and how she continued his legacy after his death. 47. Reinhard Bonnke, German evangelist who often shared his testimony of how God called him to preach the gospel in Africa and how he saw countless people come to faith through his ministry. 48. Brother Yun, Chinese Christian leader and author who often shared his testimony of how he was persecuted for his faith and how God sustained him through that hardship. 49. Nick Vujicic, Christian author and speaker who often shared his testimony of how he was born without arms or legs and how his faith helped him overcome the challenges he faced. 50. Louis Giglio, pastor and founder of Passion Conferences who often shared his testimony of how God called him to a life of worship and ministry.